You work harder than most people around you. You push yourself. You wake up early. You meet deadlines. You do what needs to be done. And yet, your income doesn't reflect that. It's stagnant. It doesn't grow in proportion to what you deliver. It doesn't keep pace with your discipline. You look at people who work less, people who seem more relaxed, people who don't have the same intensity you do, and still, they earn more. They live better. They have access to things you're still trying to reach. This shouldn't make sense. But it does. Somehow it does. You've already noticed there's a disconnect between what you do and what you receive. It's not a small disconnect. It's a structural failure. And it's not just in the economy. It's not just in the market. It's in something much closer. Something you carry without realizing it. You were taught that effort generates results. That discipline generates reward. That if you work hard enough, the money will come. But you've already worked hard enough. And the money didn't come. Not at the scale it should have. Not in the way that was promised. There's something operating beneath effort. Something that decides how much you can earn before you even try. Something that sets the ceiling of your income without asking permission. Something you didn't choose, but that chose for you. And this isn't about talent. It's not about opportunity. It's not about luck. It's about something you believe to be true about yourself. Something so deep, you don't even notice you're believing it. Something that functions as a filter. And that filter sits between you and the money you could be earning. You've felt this. You've felt the weight of a decision you didn't make, but that still limits what you can do. You've felt the sensation of being trapped in a pattern you didn't create, but that keeps repeating. You've felt that something is wrong, but you couldn't name what it is. And the truth is that most people will never name it. Most will keep believing the problem is effort, that the problem is strategy, that the problem is the world out there. But the problem isn't out there. The problem is in the way you were programmed to see yourself. And that programming is controlling your income in a way you haven't fully realized yet. Because there's an identity operating inside you, and that identity wasn't chosen by you. You've tried to explain why some people earn more and others earn less. You've heard the answers. Effort, education, talent, luck, connections, timing. These are the explanations most people accept. They're comfortable. They make sense. They organize the world in a way that seems fair, or at least comprehensible, but none of them are complete. And you already know this. You've seen hardworking people earning little. You've seen educated people without money. You've seen talented people wasting their own potential. And you've seen people without any of these attributes accumulating wealth consistently. So effort isn't enough, because you know people who work harder than you and earn less. And you know people who work less and earn more. Effort is a variable, but it's not the determining variable. It can influence, but it doesn't control. Education isn't enough either. You know people with degrees who never converted knowledge into income. You know people without formal training who built empires. Education can open doors, but it doesn't guarantee you'll walk through those doors. And it doesn't guarantee you'll feel comfortable on the other side. Talent is even more ambiguous, because talent without execution generates nothing, and execution without positioning doesn't generate wealth. You've seen talented people living in mediocrity, not because they lacked ability, but because they lacked something prior to ability, something that would allow talent to transform into monetary value, and luck. Luck is the most convenient explanation. Because if everything is luck, then you don't have to look inward. You don't have to question what's operating below the surface. You can just wait. Wait for luck to arrive. Wait for the universe to conspire. Wait for something external to change your internal reality. But luck doesn't explain patterns, and what you're living isn't an isolated event. It's a pattern. It's a repetition. It's a consistency that points to something structural, something that doesn't depend on external variables, something that's inside you. And that's why these explanations are false. Not because they're completely wrong, but because they divert attention from what really matters. They keep you looking outward, at effort, at education, at talent, at luck. And while you're looking outward, you're not looking inward. You're not seeing the invisible structure that's determining how much you can earn. Because there's a belief operating inside you. a belief about who you are, a belief about what you deserve, a belief about what's safe. And this belief isn't conscious. It's not something you think. It's something you are. It's the foundation of your behavior. It's the filter of your decisions. It's the invisible limit of your income. And this belief was installed. It was built. It was repeated until it became automatic, until it became invisible, until it became you. So the question isn't why you earn what you earn. The question is, who do you believe you are? And more importantly, who decided that for you? There's a version of you operating below consciousness, a version that wasn't created by deliberate choices, a version that was shaped by repetition, by context, by social validation, by silent punishment. This version determines what you do, what you tolerate, what you accept, and what you reject. This identity isn't something you think. It's something you assume. It's something you carry as truth. And that truth controls everything. It controls how much risk you accept. It controls how much value you believe you have. It controls how much money feels safe for you to earn. You didn't choose this identity. You inherited it. You absorbed it. You internalized it. It was installed through experiences you don't even remember anymore, experiences that seemed insignificant at the time, but that accumulated, that repeated, that normalized. And now this identity is operating. It's deciding. It's limiting. It's controlling. And you don't notice. Because it doesn't speak. It doesn't argue. It just acts. It just guides. It just defines what seems possible. When you look at an opportunity to earn more, this identity decides whether you move toward it or whether you pull back. When you need to charge for your work, this identity decides how much you ask. When you need to negotiate, this identity decides how much you give up. And all these decisions seem rational. They seem conscious. They seem yours. But they're not. They're reflexes. They're patterns. They're conditioned responses that were trained into you before you had the capacity to question them. This identity was built in layers, layer upon layer of messages about who you should be, about what was safe, about what was dangerous, about what was acceptable, about what was shameful. And each of these layers solidified. Each became part of you, until you couldn't separate what is you from what was placed in you. And this identity isn't fixed. It's fluid. It adapts. It adjusts. But it always returns to the same equilibrium point, to the same pattern, to the same limit, because that limit was programmed. It was reinforced. It was validated by everyone around you who shared the same conditioning. You were trained to accept a certain level of income, a certain level of status, a certain level of visibility. And whenever you try to exceed that level, something inside you resists. Something inside you pulls you back. Something inside you whispers that you're going too far, that you're risking too much, that you're leaving the place where you belong. And you obey. Because this identity isn't just a belief. It's an emotional structure. It's a network of sensations. It's a security system. And violating that system generates discomfort, generates anxiety, generates guilt, generates fear. So you return. You adjust. You fit back in. And you call this prudence. You call this realism. You call this responsibility. But what you're really doing is obeying an identity you didn't choose. An identity that's keeping your income exactly where it is. An identity you don't even know exists. This identity didn't appear out of nowhere. It was installed. It was built through a process that started before you had conscious memory. A process based on repetition, on reward, on punishment, on social validation. You were observed, you were judged, you were corrected, and each correction carried a message about what was safe, about what was dangerous, about who you should be, and you accepted these messages because you had no choice, because you depended on the people who were sending these messages. When you did something that pleased them, you were rewarded, with attention, with approval, with security, and you learned that this behavior was safe, that this behavior was correct, that this behavior should be repeated. When you did something that displeased them, you were punished, with rejection, with disapproval, with isolation, and you learned. You learned that this behavior was dangerous, that this behavior was wrong, that this behavior should be avoided, and this process repeated thousands of times, in thousands of situations, until you didn't need to think anymore, until you just knew, until the pattern became automatic. You were conditioned to obey, to adjust, to not stand out too much, to not ask for too much, to not want too much. And this conditioning was presented as protection, as love, as care, because the people around you believed they were preparing you for the world. But what they were really doing was preparing you to accept their world, to repeat their patterns, to carry their limits. And you learned that safety comes from obedience, that acceptance comes from conformity, that love comes from not causing discomfort. So you obeyed, you conformed, you avoided discomfort, and you called this being responsible, being mature, being realistic. But what you were really doing was internalizing an identity that accepts limits, an identity that avoids risk, an identity that settles for safety. And this identity was reinforced by everyone around you, because everyone around you carried the same identity. They didn't know they were conditioned. They thought they were just being sensible. And you grew up, and you started making decisions, and each decision reflected this identity. Each decision reinforced this pattern. Each decision kept you in the same place, in the safe place, in the known place, in the place where you didn't have to question who you were, because questioning would be dangerous, would be uncomfortable, would be a betrayal of the system that created you. So you accepted. You accepted that there are people who earn a lot, and people who earn little, and you accepted that you belong to a certain group, and you accepted that leaving that group would be arrogant, would be irresponsible, would be dangerous. And now you're here, carrying an identity that isn't yours, but that feels like it is, carrying limits that aren't real, but that seem insurmountable, carrying a version of you that was built to keep you exactly where you are. And this identity is controlling your income, because it's controlling everything. Imagine an animal that was born in a zoo. It never saw the forest. It never hunted. It never fled from predators. It never had to, because everything was provided: food, shelter, security. And in return, it only had to accept the space, accept the limits, accept that the cage was the world. Now imagine that one day the cage doors are opened. The animal looks outside. It sees the space. It sees the possibility. But it doesn't move, because the space doesn't feel safe, because the possibility doesn't feel familiar, because everything it knows is inside the cage, and everything outside seems dangerous, seems wrong, seems impossible. So it stays. It chooses to stay, but it doesn't know it's choosing, because for it, the cage isn't a limitation. The cage is reality. It's what makes sense. It's what feels right. And even if someone tries to explain that it could leave, that it could explore, that it could live differently, it doesn't believe it, because its belief about what's possible was built inside the cage. And everything outside the cage doesn't fit that belief. You're living inside a cage, but your cage isn't made of iron bars. It's made of beliefs, of identity, of conditioning. And the doors are open. They always have been. But you don't move, because everything you know is inside, and everything outside seems dangerous. You look at people who earn more, who live differently, who move with confidence, and you assume they have something you don't have, that they were born different, that they got lucky, that they have access to something you don't. But the truth is simpler and more disturbing. They just left the cage. They just stopped obeying the limits that were installed in them. They just started acting as if the space belonged to them, and the space responded, because space always responds to those who act like they belong in it. But you don't act like that, because for you, the space isn't yours. It belongs to other people, people more prepared, people more talented, people more worthy. And you accept this. You accept that there are places where you don't belong, that there are income levels that aren't for you, that there are opportunities that weren't made with you in mind, and you call this humility, realism, responsibility. But what you're really doing is obeying the cage, and the cage is grateful because it needs you to obey. Because if you question, if you leave, if you realize the limits were never real, the cage loses its power, so it keeps you busy. It keeps you working. It keeps you believing the problem is effort, strategy, the world out there. And while you're focused on that, you don't notice that the real limit is inside you, that the real prison is the identity you carry, that the real barrier is the belief that you belong where you are. And the most disturbing part is that the cage doesn't feel like a prison. It feels like security. It feels like prudence. It feels like the right place to be. Because everything inside you was trained to feel that being inside is freedom, and that leaving would be too much risk. Your identity doesn't control your income directly. It doesn't prevent you from working. It doesn't prevent you from learning. It doesn't prevent you from executing. What it does is more subtle and more effective. It controls how you perceive value, how you tolerate risk, how you make decisions, and how you position yourself. When you look at an opportunity, your identity decides whether that opportunity is for you. And this decision isn't rational. It doesn't go through conscious analysis. It happens in milliseconds. It happens as a sensation, as discomfort, as a silent certainty that this isn't your place, and you obey. Because the sensation feels real. Because the discomfort feels like a warning. Because the certainty feels like wisdom. But what you're really doing is obeying a pattern that was installed to keep you where you are, a pattern that confuses safety with stagnation. Your identity also controls how much risk you tolerate. And risk here isn't just financial. It's emotional. It's social. It's about identity itself. Because every time you try to earn more, you're risking leaving the group. You're risking being seen differently. You're risking losing the validation of people who know you as you are now. And that risk feels larger than the reward. Because your identity values belonging above expansion. It values acceptance above growth. It values safety above possibility. So you pull back. You adjust. You return to the equilibrium point. And you call this being responsible. Your identity also controls the timing of your decisions. It decides when you act, when you wait, when you give up. And that timing is rarely aligned with opportunity, because your identity isn't optimized for results. It's optimized for comfort, for predictability, for avoiding the feeling of being out of place. So you act too late, or too early, or never. And you justify it. You find reasons. You construct narratives. But the truth is, you weren't in control. Your identity was. And it decided based on what felt safe, not what felt profitable. And perhaps most importantly, your identity controls how much you believe you're worth. And this isn't about self-esteem. It's about the value you accept as fair, the value you ask for, the value you defend, because your identity has a number that seems reasonable, a number that seems appropriate for someone like you. And whenever you try to ask for more, something inside you resists. Something inside you says you're exaggerating, that you're being arrogant, that you're asking for more than you deserve. And you give in, because the resistance feels like a warning, because the discomfort feels like truth. But the discomfort isn't truth. The discomfort is just the signal that you're leaving the cage, that you're challenging the pattern, that you're violating the identity that was installed in you, and your identity will do everything to bring you back. Because it wasn't programmed to make you wealthy, it was programmed to keep you safe. And safety, in its system, means staying where you are. Most people never realize they're operating from a conditioned identity. Because the identity doesn't present itself as conditioning, it presents itself as truth, as reality, as who you are. And everything around reinforces this. Everything around validates this, because everyone around you is operating from the same structure. They have their own cages, their own identities, their own limits. And when you try to leave, when you try to question, when you try to act differently, they react. They pull you back, not because they want to harm you, but because you leaving threatens their cage. Because if you can leave, then they can too. And that's uncomfortable. That's dangerous. That requires them to question everything they believe to be true about themselves. So they convince you that you're wrong, that you're risking too much, that you're changing, that you're becoming someone you're not, and you believe them, because they seem to be taking care of you, because they seem to be protecting you, because they seem to be bringing you back to reality. But what they're really doing is bringing you back to the cage, back to the conditioning, back to the identity that keeps everyone in the same place. And questioning this feels dangerous, because questioning means admitting you were conditioned, that you're not who you think you are, that everything you believe about yourself might just be an installed pattern. And that's terrifying, because if you're not who you think you are, then who are you? So most don't question, most accept, most keep operating from the same identity, the same cage, the same limit, and they call this being authentic, being true to themselves, being realistic, but they're not being authentic. They're being obedient. They're not being true to themselves. They're being true to the conditioning. They're not being realistic. They're being limited. And the most disturbing part is, they'll never realize it. Because to realize it, they would have to look inward. They would have to question. They would have to accept that everything they believe about who they are might be false. And that's a risk the identity will never allow them to take. So they stay. They continue. They repeat. And they never realize the cage was open the whole time, that the limits were never real, that the identity controlling their life was never theirs. And you? Are you realizing it now? You've made it this far. You've listened. You've absorbed. And now something inside you is different. Not necessarily better, just different. Because you can't pretend you don't know anymore. You know now that there's an identity operating. You know it was installed. You know it's controlling. And you know it's not you. But knowing doesn't change anything, because the identity doesn't care what you know. It cares what you do, and it's already preparing to bring you back. It will convince you this was just theory, that this was just content, that this doesn't apply to you. It will remind you of all the reasons why you are where you are. It will show you all the risks of trying to leave. It will make you feel that questioning is dangerous, and you'll obey. Because obeying is easier. Because obeying is safer. Because obeying is what you've always done. And in a few days, you'll be back to the pattern, back to the limit, back to the cage, and you'll call this returning to reality, being responsible, stopping the dreaming. But what you're really doing is returning to the conditioning, and the conditioning will be grateful, because it needs you to return, because without you, it doesn't exist. But there's a part of you that won't forget, a part that will keep observing, a part that will start noticing the moments when you pull back, the moments when you give in, the moments when you choose safety instead of possibility. And that part will whisper. It will remind you that you know, that you saw, that you understood. And you'll have to decide. Not now, but at some point. You'll have to decide whether you keep obeying an identity that isn't yours, or whether you start questioning, whether you start challenging, whether you start acting as if the limits aren't real. And that decision won't be easy, because the identity will fight. It will generate discomfort. It will generate fear. It will generate guilt. And you'll have to choose whether the discomfort is worth it, whether the possibility is greater than the safety, whether leaving the cage is more important than staying where everyone expects you to stay. And maybe you'll choose to stay. Maybe you'll decide the cage is comfortable enough, that the limit is acceptable, that the identity, even though it's not yours, is easier to carry than the uncertainty of building a new one. And there's no judgment in that, because most choose to stay, most choose to obey, most choose safety. But now you know it's a choice, and that changes everything. Because before you thought you had no option. You thought you were trapped. You thought the limit was real. But now you know the limit is just a belief. And beliefs can be challenged. Beliefs can be replaced. Beliefs can be abandoned. But only if you decide it's worth it. Only if you decide that your income, your life, your identity are worth more than the comfort of obedience. only if you decide that you are more than the pattern that was installed in you. And the truth is, you already know the answer. You already know whether you're going to act or whether you're going to return. You already know whether you're going to question or whether you're going to obey. You already know. Because the identity has already decided for you, and now it's watching, it's waiting, it's ready to bring you back. And will you let it?